Morning, everyone. My name's Chris Newell, and I'm from the Passamaquoddy tribe, born and raised in Madocmagook. Now live in Connecticut. Good to see you all here today. What I'm doing here today is, a lot of these events start with land acknowledgments and things like that. This is a little bit different. I'm a Wabanaki person, and I want to do is tell you a little bit of history and then kind of set the energy with a welcome song. And the history I want to talk about, of course, is that, we are here on Wabanaki homelands. We think about it, the city of Portland, the state of Maine celebrated 200 years a few years back. But in the grand scheme of things, the 12,000 years of Wabanaki existence, that 200 years is like the snap of a fingers. And the world looked very different back then. So, for a second, just imagine this world, the way nature intended it to be, and how Wabanaki people stewarded this land for generations. And what I was always told was that there was so much food that it was impossible to starve. So this land can give us quite a bit as we take care of it. Now, as part of the Wabanaki peoples, this welcome song I'm going to sing for you comes from a tradition. During the days of the Confederacy, one of the things that we did was we agreed upon peace amongst us as Wabanaki people. And one of the ways that we produced that peace was with the way we chose our leadership. And so what would happen is if a leader passed away in my community, in the Passamaquoddy community, the Zogam passed away, then we would go into a year of mourning. And what the English called the captains, what we call captains, which were just family leaders, would take over leadership of the village. And then after that year, we would invite the surrounding communities, the surrounding Wabanaki peoples, invite their leadership to our community for choosing. Their purpose of arriving was to choose our next leader. Now, if you think about it, it's a very smart way of keeping peace over a very large geographic area, and it worked very well for a long time. And there was a protocol that went along with it. When the arriving chiefs, the visitors would come, they would stand in their canoes, and before they came onto the land, they would be officially welcomed with a welcome song. So we use music in a lot of different ways, and one of the things I was told about it in the Passamaquoddy community by my father and others is that we have a belief that Passamaquoddies, at least, believe that music has magical abilities. Now, when I say that, English kind of fails, because magic is not the right word. It's something that we all experience as human beings. Anybody that has a favorite song, I'm sure there's people in here that could raise their hand to that. If that song moves you in some way, shape, or form, that's what we're talking about, is that music has the ability to do that to us as human beings. So I want to begin today's symposium with all of my fellow Wabanaki panelists here, welcoming them as well, but also all of you. We are here in the state of Maine. Regardless of the history, we are all here now, and it's up to all of us to look to the future to take care of this land. So this is Passamaquoddy Welcome Song. This particular rendition, we have multiple ones, was taught to my father, Wayne Newell, by a woman named Eva Toma when he was a young man. So this rendition, I always tell people, has been in use at least for 150 years. Aguano de heli aguano de aguano de heli aguano de ho ya ne 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 aguano de eli aguano de aguano de no de. Ho ya ne, ho ya ne, ho ya ne. Ho ya ne, ho ya ne, ho ya ne. Tahoe, Holy One. Now I'm going to turn the microphone over to my good friend Mark Bessier, director of the Portland Museum of Art.
I'm always proud to follow Chris, but it's always a tough act to follow, I have to admit. I just want to begin by thank you all for coming out this morning. We have community elders, we have cultural leaders, we have educators, museum professionals, and people who really care about the work that's going to be done today. Today's work is very important dialogue. I think in particular the times that we are in, where we all need to be speaking out about issues like we're discussing today. This convening, even though it was organized more than a year ago, is more important today than it would have been even a year ago. The work has to continue. We need to step up and also speak out. So thank you for joining us today as we discuss together how museum reinstallation projects in partnership with Indigenous communities can create lasting change in American art scholarship, exhibitions, and collection stewardship. I have a very nice acknowledgement statement that I was going to read, which we've had help to write, but I have to say, after Chris's opening, I don't think I'm going to read it. I think what Chris provided for us as an opening moment to this is stronger than anything I could say on behalf of this institution or the groups who put together those words. His words and song were so powerful that they're going to stand for our acknowledgement today. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of the Terra Foundation of Art. One thing to remember in these challenging times, anybody, foundation, philanthropy, people who are supporting art and culture have got to be thanked. So let's all thank the Terra Foundation for enabling us to be here. I'd also like in particular to thank Gabriel, who's over here, who has a beautiful work of art upstairs, Teresa Secord, who also has work in our collection, for the work helping us bring these folks together to have these conversations, be sure that we're including and thinking about all the key issues of the day. They have been big supporters of us, challengers of us, and making us a better museum. We have done a lot of work at this museum, but we have a lot more work to do, and their guidance and leadership has put us into a position where I think we can come to a convening like this and be very proud of the work we've done. But we're really here to learn about not how well we did with our work, but how we can make it better, because there's always to be done better. We really do feel that way, particularly with this work. So thank you again, particularly Gabriel and Teresa. This is, as I mentioned, a critical time for artists, museums, and institutions across our country, and it's more important than ever to create spaces to support and bring solidarity. Since the opening of Passages, which is upstairs, which I hope you all have seen, in 2023, we have continued to explore new models for partnership with Wabanaki communities across our region. But we know, as I said, there's still much work to be done. Artists have always been at the vanguard, pointing us to future possibilities, and it's our hope that today's discussion will not only highlight best practices and successful models, but also point the way to new beginnings. I'd also like to acknowledge Remy Mize, our curator here at the museum, who's also done an incredible job bringing together this community of artists, cultural leaders to provide a great exhibition and really the platform here at the Portland Museum of Art. When Teresa was coming in, Teresa's always great. She's always supporting other artists. It's never about Teresa. It's like, what's happening next? Where can you go see more art? And so I do want to acknowledge out front that the Indian Basket Maker Alliance has a series of programs coming up, and there's some brochures outside. One of the big ones is going to be the Dawnland Festival, which I believe is July 12th and 13th up in Bar Harbor, actually the College of the Atlantic. So please be sure to attend that as well. I'm going to take a deep breath and just take a few seconds for everybody to think about why we're here today and what you'd like to get out of this day, and to acknowledge time and space and presence. What we need to do, I think, today is be here, grounding your feet, be where you are. I know we've all got a coffee. We woke up, it's Saturday and it's raining out, but this is really important work. And the dialogue we have with our audiences, with our participants, is crucial. So please bring your whole selves here today, and any questions you may have or any curiosities, this is the place to share them out. This is a place of learning today. I'd now like to welcome our speakers of our first panel, which will center the perspectives on emerging artists. Nolan Altvader, Maya Etayan, Jared Lank, and Lakota Sanborn. Their panel will be moderated by PMA curator Rami Mize, so please help me in joining them to the stage.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yes, great. Okay, thank you all so much for coming out on a Saturday morning for this incredibly special event, and a huge thank you to Nolan, Jared, Maya, and Lakota for helping kick off this day with your perspectives and experience. I'm so grateful to you all. I know some of it was a big journey and a lot of time and effort, so thank you for sharing your time with us. As Mark said, my name is Rami Mize. I'm the Associate Curator of American Art here at the Portland Museum of Art, and I had the pleasure of being part of the organizing team behind the reinstallation of our Art of the Americas holdings on the second floor, which we titled Passages in American Art. Many of the people in this room were crucial contributors to that project, and it's ongoing, and we think of it as a living installation that we hope is responsive and fluid and brings opportunities to continue to address new questions and issues that we hear from you all, from the community. And we felt that this particular convening was timely because, you know, that work has been done. It opened in 2023. And it's been amazing, but you know, we can't stop there. There's a lot of momentum to continue to build on, and there's a lot of ways that we can continue to advance that work here and across our region. So we want to welcome the community and museum colleagues, community members who are here who can help us in what is really a collective effort, not just here, but well beyond. With that, I'd like to just kick off by inviting the four of you, if you don't mind, introducing yourselves and sharing, you know, why you have been drawn to make art in the way that you do. And anyone can start.
Why are you all looking at me? All right. My name is Lakota Sanborn. I'm a Penobscot interdisciplinary artist and community organizer. I work in film, and I work in a lot of mixed media pieces, collage work. I work with a lot of archives as well. And the question of what brought me to make art, I don't know. I feel like for me, it's kind of just adhering to what I feel is one of the most important experiences of being a human being, you know. Being kind of immersed in this creative practice is what gives my life purpose, I would say, and being surrounded by different artisans and artists in the community, and growing up with my mother, especially being a lifetime craft maker and bead worker, just having that around me all the time, it just seemed like the natural progression for myself. And yeah, I think that if I wasn't making art, I don't know what I would be doing. So, yeah.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Okay. My name is Maya Ditiazatian. I am Penobscot and Passamaquoddy. I am an artist who mainly works in the photographic medium. My work involves the landscape mainly, and I would say that the reason I make art is because it comes as a natural thing to do. It's almost, it's the most human thing there is to express yourself and make sense of this world. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name's Jared Lank. I'm a Mi'kmaq citizen. I'm registered in Canada, but I grew up in southern Maine my whole life, so I'm off-reservation Native person. I'm a filmmaker and photographer and a musician. I make a lot of interdisciplinary work. A lot of it culminates in both narrative and documentary and experimental film. It's kind of like the modality that I can put all my creative stuff in one spot and package it up, and so everyone can see it. I make stuff. I was just telling Rami this the other day. Like, I've realized now in making things throughout the years that creativity and creative expression is this kind of cathartic therapy for me. It's like how I'm a pretty introverted person and kind of like a latchkey kid, and I think that music and photography and film and visual expression is something for me as a way to express emotion and let out like a bunch of things and process externally. And as it pertains to what we're talking about today, a lot of that inherently embodies lived experience and identity. It's not only about that, but it always ends up being about that because it's an inner reflection in an outside kind of mirror. So that's why I make it. It's like my therapy. I don't have a therapist. It's like this is my therapist.
Everybody, thank you for opening us up in a good way with the song, Chris. Nolan Altvader, Passamaquoddy from Zibayig, and also come from Penobscot relatives as well. And I think similarly with what's been shared, sort of this sort of idea of aesthetic expression with sort of fulfillment of identity in art. And I feel like within the particular context of practicing that as a Passamaquoddy person, that comes with this kind of a specific understanding of a human that is found or has been forged by our ancestors across time, and that sort of adds to two fundamental reasons why sort of I enjoy approaching art and using it as an expression. There is sort of that creating that sort of rhetorical and aesthetical space in sort of times where our versions of human and our ideas of relating to the land has been denied from us. So like working through that as sort of generating space to continue our stories and our understandings of who we are and where we come from. But it's not all about like that in the context of like colonialism. It's also this continued practice of care that I feel like we carry as Wabanaki people and artists that shows up in all other life ways beyond art, this particular sort of attention to caring for who we are in the homelands that we come from, and using art as to express that and share with each others, but also for that individual kind of like self-expression and feeling okay in your own skin as well. Yeah.
Thanks all. That was beautiful. And I think it reminds us that, art is an inherent part of life, of our beings, and it does not need museums to be created by any measure. But museums are some of the major systems and infrastructure that we have in the moment that I think we're all wanting to think constructively with, and also acknowledge the imperfections of that system. And so I'm curious for you all, what has been your experience of museums as artists, as encountering Wabanaki art in those spaces or not? Are there any observations you've had recently about how things look now versus how they did maybe 10 or 20 years ago? Pick up any thread from that you like, but would love to hear your thoughts on that sort of museological landscape that we all find ourselves in one way or another. Just an easy one.
I can speak to a little bit, and maybe I'll stir the conversation. When I was growing up, I grew up in not a Native community, so I was surrounded by mostly non-Native people. I have a very small Native family kind of environment in that way. And I'd say societally, I'm a 90s kid, and my identity writ large was not validated in my environment, right? Like being Native, where I grew up anyway, was kind of like a past tense thing. It was like this disappearing race thing, right? And I think in a way, because societies are institutions, they're institutions of our society, they represent the material and expressive cultures of the world, especially like art museums, right? And then you have other museums that collect things, and those are its own conversation. But as I was growing up, I felt like what I experienced as a Native person in like the 90s and 2000s was not reflected in those spaces, right? Like it almost felt like you're stepping into this, like the halls of like your world that you live in. Like this is like the epitome of like what our culture is about as, Americans or whatever. And as a Native person, I felt like I was never represented. And if it was like in a way, and again, this is my own experience, it was just not in a way that resonated with my personal lived experience as a Native person. So it informally invalidated my identity in that way, made me feel like, well, I guess I can't consider myself to be in this like conformed idea of what being Native identity is. And I think like what I've found recently, and like working with the PMA for the Pastoralism with Ramey, is that I think a lot of that, as an adult now, I realize how relational the work has to be to understand how to like truly express and build that trust and kind of ability for Native people to show up in a space that's been, I would say, pretty like uninviting and hostile across like history to Native people. So how do you, the only way to allow Native people into those spaces in a way, not in like a permissions way, but allow them to feel like they're welcome and that they can actually own that space with their art or whatever, is that you have to build trust and relationships and allow a relinquishing of control in that way. And that's something that I see that's emerging, but there's new, I would say, paradigms of thought around that. I'm not an expert on that, but to sum up my whole point is like growing up, I felt like the reflection in the mirror of institutions as a Native person, growing up in a non-Native community and going to these things with mostly non-Native people, like who I was never in those spaces. And increasingly I see that there's a concerted effort by some curators and some museums that say we really want to make sure that we get that right and feel like you can show up like that. And it's like important cornerstone foundational premise to the effort, not just this extractive idea of like, we just want to put some natives in our museum to like have a Native exhibit, because I've seen that too, and that isn't great. But there's a world where it's being done in this more progressive way. So yeah, I don't know if anyone feels the same way, but
Yeah, I feel like for me, growing up and going to different museums, one of the things that I experienced a lot was this tendency, I think, not necessarily in Maine, but this tendency to have all of like the ethnic art kind of congregated in usually like the basement level. Like, there's usually like this hierarchy of like, oh yeah, and then the Renaissance is up here on the top floor, or modern art, contemporary art, and having, art from Africa or Asiatic countries or Native American, kind of relegated to the basement floor. And always just thinking about that, this hierarchy in thinking about how there is that past tense basis in a lot of cases. And obviously a lot of our works would be not always in art museums necessarily, but also in like historic, like anthropological, like through an anthropological lens, I guess. And there has been a lot of work in recent years, especially like within the last 30, 20 years or so, to really reclaim a lot of that, and a lot of relationships have been established. I know between especially local museums here and the tribes, and like working to come to agreement in terms of ownership over those things. But yeah, I've thought about this a lot, just in terms of like going to Minneapolis and seeing Mi'kmaq baskets, or like going to Detroit and seeing Passamaquoddy baskets there, or in DC. It's like seeing the breadth and the scope of how far our art can. I haven't traveled a lot, so maybe they're like all over the world. I don't know. But just seeing the imprint that we've really had in our legacy has been really inspirational to me, but oftentimes I think there is this kind of past tense basis where I haven't witnessed a lot through growing up until more recently, especially a lot of like more contemporary artists or contemporary art forms being I don't know what the word is, to being uplifted, I guess, or being exhibited in the same way that, yeah, you have that top floor of the contemporary artists who are really important. It's like, well, where are the native people, right? Because the context of American art, it's like, that's just a small chapter within the overall history of our art form and our art forms that have been here for much longer, right? And so I just think about that a lot, yeah.
I would have to echo what everybody's kind of contributed about. When I was growing up, I felt like I did not see the full expression of our identity represented at museums. And this created a sort of disconnect between me and imagining myself in these places as a working artist and showing in galleries and different museums. And I feel like when I finally started showing my work at different places and had the opportunity to show my work here, it created a sense of almost like imposter syndrome, like I didn't belong in this space. And it's something I really had to grapple with, that we've been excluded from these places for so long that we start to get used to it. And I would say that it creates a sense of being some of the first people introduced into, as Wabanaki people introduced into the museum setting. It creates a feeling of tokenization that is really hard to avoid. And I feel like that's something that we can collectively try to avoid in the future in some way, but there's a lot of, we could talk more about that. But, yeah.
And what I'll just sort of add to it is I often think a lot about the intersections between sort of land dispossession and how that's been sort of justified through specific sort of like jurisprudence and policies, and like similarly that intersection with more intellectual property, the intersection between that and how it's impacted Indigenous communities throughout history, and kind of similar on the institutional end, sort of how museums operate in terms of the policies and laws that they uphold and represent is very much like in direct conflict with how Indigenous peoples relate to their land, but also to their understandings of art and their expressions, and the need to, and thankfully I feel like specifically with the relationships that have been built or starting to be fostered and built here in what is now Maine, through the PMA and then through other projects that have unfolded, is like recognizing that and approaching sort of agreements with artists really differently through more of a relational process and kinship process, and also like developing kind of specific memorandum of understandings that really lay out the responsibilities of institutions and also with the artists, and also emphasizing the protection of that knowledge that is coming from communities, where it's just not extracted, and in some ways, like, again, it's like, it's all like property is all about ownership and control. So like not treating what we create as property just to be put into museum spaces. And then I feel like sort of an intersection with us here, I feel like Lakota is kind of getting into like a lot of museum is curated, Indigenous art is a lot of times curated through a very much like anthropological gaze, with this like very romantic or sort of like craft understanding of art that is applied to us. And I feel like what connects us as visual artists is kind of like recognizing like the diversity and creativity within Wabanaki artistic practices. And it's nothing new. Like, we've always used images to tell stories. Like, we have rock art that is pecked into ledges that are, you know, up to 5,000 years old. So we've always relied on these forms of art that's not just like baskets or beadwork, or even in like more sort of stereotypical like dream catchers and stuff like that. Like, we've always utilized a diverse set of tools to tell stories, and we always will. And kind of curating exhibits through that and through those different agreement and approaches with artists and the communities that they're coming from is crucial to continuing supporting like these relationships and giving Indigenous and Wabanaki artists more sort of narrative self-determination in the work that they do.
I do want to add that just one thing about the anthropology stuff, because I have a background in anthropology. It's like, yeah, so much of our society when it comes to conforming Native identity to how we fit into a Western scope. Like, we're also deeply ingrained in this like unilineal evolution theory where it's like Stone Age and the Bronze Age and, you know, industrial, you know, and we look at it like by default that any type of lithic technology like stone, or like even using woodland period stuff to contemporary forms like in like basket making, we've been kind of subconsciously ingrained with this idea that it's inferior to like the iPhone, and it's not necessarily the case. It's just that we've been taught that there's this stratification of evolution that puts Western society at the top of that strata, and that way of progressing is, you know, the top of the mountain, so to speak. And that's not true. And I think that it's great to hear people say, like, I was just telling Rami this the other day and some other folks, like, I taught an anthropology class one time and I was talking to my students about how like the lithic era of like native technology, everyone was able to make their own means to an end, like every individual for thousands, tens of thousands of years. Like, and for most of human history, people could provide for themselves indefinitely with rocks. And like, that's way more advanced in my eyes than an iPhone. Like, none of us could do that, you know? And I would say most people today couldn't survive individually like that at that level and then like expand on that. So it's just interesting how we're so ingrained with this idea that like modalities of creating expression or like utility for certain materials, by default, we look at it like inferior, and it's not. And it's something that needs to be addressed in the future, or now and then in the future. So anyway, sorry, Rand.
No, that was so great, guys. Thank you so much. Like, my mind is buzzing. But I really appreciate how you all are stressing that this work must be inherently relational as opposed to transactional or extractive. I think museums have been accustomed to a more transactional model of acquisition of art. That is the formal term we use, which is a sort of finite purchase, you know, an exchange between the institution and the individual, or a gallery, et cetera. But these works of art are so much more than just a commodity. You know, they have histories and relations that are bound up in them. They are belongings that should be accessible. They are opportunities for learning and teaching. So I think, you know, through passages, like, one of the things that became so immediately clear was it's not just about the work of art that's on view. It's about all the attendant networks and conversations and relationships that animate that installation. And honestly, the process is so much more important than the product in that way. And I think, you know, for the advisors and the contributors to that project, we had a lot of really powerful, sustained conversations around how do Indigenous values become ingrained in the space itself and the methods behind that work. So I would love to hear from your own perspectives, you know, how should Indigenous knowledge shape museum practice moving forward? You've kind of gotten into it a little bit, but maybe we can linger on that a bit more. And the telling of histories of so-called American art. And in what ways might museums more meaningfully build transparency and center Indigenous values and relations in processes and programs?
I think for me, the first thing that comes to mind is building stronger relationships with the people in the communities. I know that there's not a lot of access for children growing up in the communities, these sort of spaces. And so without that sort of inspiration and access, they don't have the ability to see themselves here as well. And in addition to that, I know there's been talks of different acquisition models being codified and different access being given to tribal members so that we can always have access to these items in the collection. And right now, I think that it's sort of not completely codified and just sort of a loose agreement. And having something set in a standard practice would really ensure that people can access our tribal histories whenever we want to.
I have like just a thought about it, and I'll probably have more in a minute, but one thing when it comes to like ingraining culture and ways, not just life ways, but like worldview stuff into my own work, and I think this is kind of an extension for a lot of Native artists in general, is like more broadly in creating something, like the act of creation and producing a thing is very much, try to embody this idea of it being like very animistic process, and like it's a stewardship process of being in this mode of thought where you have a creative inspiration, and then from there it's kind of like your responsibility to bring this thing into the world, and at some point it kind of gains its own animistic trait and becomes its own thing, right? So if you treat things and you try to reject the notion of property, possession, and Western ideas of like collecting and putting things in vaults and whatever, what does that mean when you make something that is, you cherish its essence the way you would any other life, right? And what does that look like in a space where things are treated like property? Like, would you treat it like property if you treated it like a living thing, right? And it had its own quality and trait, right? So that's something I try to think about a lot, just as a thought practice in my own work, but also in a way that I think like really helps get the framing around this idea that you have to cherish and honor the being that is this creative creation that you've made, right? And like, what does that mean in these spaces? Like, you know, it's just something that I think often we have to question our understanding of status quo and how things work. And I think that there's a very fundamental way that we can look at things and say like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like, you know, moving toward the MOU models and things like that. Like Maya said, like codifying things as just like standard practice. But inside of that work, I think in order to make the best evolution of the idea is to really start pushing your idea of what it is you're actually talking about and tearing it back to the studs, so to speak, to say like, if we value art the way that we value life, like how do we think about that in these spaces and honor that as another seat at the table, not just as this like interaction between us owning it, you know? So I don't know if that's on point, but it's something I think about. I think about that like every day. And I'm a new dad, so I'm like, you know, everything I think about is like life and all that right now. So, you know.
Yeah, I think also like extending off of that too, definitely agree with that. Recently somebody had said something to me and I was like, I both agreed with it, but also felt kind of weird. Just saying like, oh yeah, like I look at the piece that we got from you every day, and I realized this, we don't just have a piece by you, we have a piece of you. I was like, oh, jeez.
Exactly.
Like, okay. But you know, there is a certain element of truth to that, and it's, you know, it's like there's a certain level, I think, in at least my experience, and I think a lot of artists' experience of like, you're kind of channeling something, right, into being from somewhere beyond, I don't know. Yeah, it's just like pulled from the ether, pulled from creation, pulled from everything that exists, right? But I do agree with Jared. It's like it takes on a life of its own in a way. It's like you have a responsibility to that. And so I think a lot about like almost private ownership, right, of a piece of myself and also a piece of something that deserves its own level of sovereignty as a piece, right? Like, and when another tangent off of this is thinking about kind of that loose framework that you discussed, and like how a lot of times it can be kind of this handshake deal of community relationship with an institution that isn't necessarily codified or like made into protocols and like established, right? And something that has been seen in many cases is you'll have like one or two staff people developing these amazing relationships that will go on for a long time, and then they retire or they get another opportunity, they leave, and then it's like you have to start from square one. And so I think in terms of indigenous ways of being and protocol, it's like it has to be community building, right? And you build community by having a community of people from inside the institution, from our communities as well. There's multiple points of contact so that in the event that somebody leaves, it doesn't just all fall away, you know, and that's so important. And to actually have that written into, I don't know if it's like a bylaws thing or what it is exactly, but I feel like that's very important, and that is moving more towards what we need and like the way that we exist in the world as well, you know, just to ensure that it's not a one generation that has this relationship, it's multi-generational, and building off from that, you know. I feel like that's so important, is just to be really forward focused and building off the work that has come before us, obviously, but to really think about the generations ahead of us and how we can work to establish things that will better their lives in the future. Yeah.
And kind of continuing on with community, well, first, like, regarding kind of like indigenous like knowledge, like I feel like recognizing that that's not a monolith, and like needing to work more from like the place-based frameworks and understandings from, in this case, like Wabanaki people, especially with like, say, collections or archives where maybe specific materials or specific things that these institutions house have a very developed protocol and how they should be treated and how they should be in relation to what they're surrounded in, and like how our should you return this to the communities in which it came from, like obviously like prioritizing that if the people have capacity to have it returned, and if they don't, how are you building capacity in their own communities to house these things and be in relation to them? But then also, like, how are you going to know these things without having that community here? Like these specific relationships that go beyond than just what is sitting in front of you, like the processes of care and being in relation to it. How is that being maintained and respected? And then to kind of return back to that community thing, like, you know, rarely we, like as Wabanaki people, like we're always kind of like confined to defining communities on like through borders, whether it's through like reservation systems or through institutions, and just recognizing that like our conceptions of homeland and community like extends those borders that are forced upon us. So like with that, like how are institutions and museums also building more capacity outside of their own walls? I think that's starting to become a process within sort of exhibit working, like sort of developing exhibits with Wabanaki communities, where it's not just like doing, creating the art, but when it comes down to the process of it, like I'm thinking of the Tagaga Bimuk project that we did with a lot of sort of partners in that, but part of that was like, you know, we were bringing in like Wabanaki youth to work with clay and had this resurgence of this practice of working with clay in the communities. And then we also had artists being able to experiment with new materials, and like recognizing like that ability and opportunities, we've been segmented from them and not have them because of the histories in which that we faced. So just like recognizing like it's not only about like building community here, it's also like supporting where these artists are coming from and the communities that they come from, and building that more internal capacity in their own communities as well. And I feel like that does need to become more normalized in these process and relationships that institutions have with not just the individuals of Wabanaki communities, but also like where the people in which they come from as well, and thinking forward to future generations and how are we going to assure we're continuing creating these opportunities for Wabanaki arts to thrive and transform as they always have and they always will.
I also, sorry, I just want to add, and we'll probably talk about this more, but the opportunity thing that Maya and Nolan both had just mentioned, like, I think there's an opportunity there for not just representation and access to the spaces, but access to opportunities to exist and work inside of museums for Native people to be curators and directors and all that, of not just Native museums or Native-centric museums, but like larger institutions, you know? So there should be like opportunities for Native youth and communities to interface to see themselves with a future possibility of working as a professional in the art world as a curator or in a museum or in collections or whatever, you know? So across the spectrum of opportunity, not just as an artist only in a museum, like that's the only way you can interface with an institution like that, but you can also work inside of an institution and be given those opportunities and work in that capacity too, and see yourself in there. So just want to add that.
Yeah, thank you all. That idea of, you know, paving professional pathways that are solid and real and have range, you know, beyond one role is so crucial. And I think also the idea of reaching out beyond the museum walls, like you all are sharing. Museums are sort of famous for like, oh, you come to us. I mean, you all came to us for this symposium, but like, what would it look like to host something together in community, you know, beyond here, and to do something more collaboratively like that. And I think that is, those are all incredible ideas and really urgent directives. And I'm also thinking about that, the intersection of community and place that you all were sharing. And it's got me thinking just, you know, the importance of land and water grounds all of your work, both in your art and in your advocacy. You know, Nolan, you've expressed how your work is grounded in place-based protocols. Lakota, you've shared how you are invested in cultural continuity and land return. Jared, you use the amazing description sacred ecology in your work. And Maya, I know that you have foregrounded your work's investment in your connection to the natural world broadly. So I'd love for you all to just sort of share how place informs your art and your work. Big question, sorry.
I don't know. I feel like place is everything. You know, everything relates back to the land. Like us as human beings relate back to the land. All living things on this planet, like we're all interconnected through that, right? We're all a part of the land. Even though there's been this indoctrination in this colonial epistemological framework of just like seeing the land as other or seeing us as separated from the rest of the animal kingdom, like that's just not the way the world works. And that framing of our consciousness like has led to us being able to degrade and pollute and destroy the natural world, you know? And so, I mean, yeah, I mean, the basis for like everything, it's hard to put to words, I think. Everything ties back to the land. Like sovereignty ties back to the land. Our ability to have clean food and water and survivance. And so to have art reflect that and our experience within the landscape, both historically, presently, and future looking, I feel it's just critical to show that not only have we been here forever, we will continue to be here forever, and like that has somewhat like it's based in the land, you know, because it's not going anywhere, and we're not going anywhere either. So just helping to represent and reflect on that eternalness, you know, of the landscape, which has always existed in us as people who, yeah.
Yeah, I think like to really put it simply, like it all goes back to the land, and by land we're not just referring to like the material soil or waterways and forest. It's the relationships in which we have built with place through our own knowledge systems and our own ways of being in relation to each other and to other indigenous communities across what is now New England and within our homelands, like as a Wabanaki Confederacy, and then also with, like, as Lakota was saying, like with non-human forms of life as well, like those were all fundamental to our understandings of land. And to put that in the current context where, you know, the main drive of what makes colonialism sort of distinct as a force of power is that necessity for dispossession and land. And I think, like, it's that same sort of like, it's the same specific kind of like relationship to land in terms of like colonialism needs land just as we do, but it's that matter of how. And through colonialism, it's very much through that like sort of dissected difference and controlling how things relate to each other. So like when it comes to art, like how do you generate that space and thought and aesthetics and imagery and knowledge, like given that history? And that is something that colonialism can't take away from us, is our ability to do that, no matter how hard it tries. And I don't want to put that, like, that's sort of like my why I approach art, in order like to put it completely just in dialogue with colonialism. It's absolutely not just that. It's sort of dialectically related to it, but it's this continued practice of something we've always done as Wabanaki people, is like, in the way that I approach it is specifically like looking at the roles of images that's played in our mobilization of understanding of who we are, and in creating place as well. Like I sort of referred back to like the rock art, or what sort of archaeologists and anthropologists call petroglyphs. Like those really like were a tool, an image making tool that told these stories of our experiences on our landscape through specific understandings of that place. And that very much in tandem informed how we understood ourselves. And with it literally being pecked into stone, our ancestors were also thinking ahead of future generations to remind them of who we are, and using storytelling to do that. And at the center of that is land. Through that process, you're creating place, you're creating identity, and that's what, like, I feel like Indigenous people mean when we say like we are the land. It's not in this really romantic perspective where we just view ourselves as like the part of like a wilderness or nature. It's this really in-depth intellectual relational worldview that's been built across generations, and that's sort of what Indigenous knowledge is. And it takes context in that specific place-based form. But yeah, at the center of it is land. To be Indigenous to a place, it's rooted in the land, in that sense. Yeah.
So I approach in my practice the landscape as being our relation, but also as being a witness and an archive to the intense intergenerational trauma that colonialism has brought to the landscape. And I explore the ways we interact with and also belong to the landscape, and how colonialism has physically changed every facet of the land. I think it's really important to remember how we existed since time immemorial, and I really strive to photograph what can't be seen, the feelings of spirit and energy that still are interconnected with us in the landscape.
So I feel like it all resonates really well. It's great. And similarly, like to what Maya said, I spent like a lot of my experience with making things is kind of what I've found started as a deep meditation in place to try to understand it. the natural world that exists, not to like separate ourselves from it, but you know, I grew up as a kid, someone who didn't see that separation. And as I've matured in this world, I feel a pressure to feel that separation more and more. You know, it's like Nolan said, it's very othered from us, and that's a very Western thing. But my work that I make, I think that indigeneity is a shared kind of truth of what it means to be human. Indigenous knowledge is this thing, it's a beacon of light that shows us what it means to be in place, in a sense, where we are part of that ecology and we're not just on the outside of it, but we do serve a purpose in the greater scheme of things. And I think, you know, similarly to like what Maya said, I am a strong believer that place holds memory, that the land holds memory. And I think that in a lot of ways, it wants to share that truth with all of us, but it requires a deep amount of trust and relationality for it to open up, because it's been a long time that it has not been able to share its story. So in order to do that, in my practice, what I've found is that you have to spend a lot of time getting to know a place. Like I made a 7-minute short film that I spent a year going to a place like every week to just figure it out and hear it. And I think like, as much as I said my work's like my own therapy, in a lot of ways it feels like the place is therapy too. Like it gets to really open up to you, and you get to see components of the land that have changed, but also these, I don't know if I want to call them like artifacts, but these interwoven pieces that are immemorial, right? Like the sounds of birds and the way the trees move and the way the wind blows through a place, like all of those things are what culminate into a space, and they're saying something, right? So in my work, I try to really listen and channel that into it. And I think that in a way, I've landed on film, experimental film and narrative film as a way, because I don't remember who said it, and I'm sorry, I can't credit their name appropriately, but I heard this thing one time and it really resonated with me that watching a film in a theater is the closest thing to making shadow puppets in a fire in a cave 200,000 years ago that we all do and have done. All of our ancestors did that collectively as humans. And I felt like in that moment, like that's why I love seeing things in a theater. It's like this womb-like environment where we're all safe and protected, and it's someone sharing a story with you in this very intimate way where we're all collectively experiencing it, but it's very individual at the same time. And I feel like, for me, I get to go into this relation with the land to understand it, and then I get to bring that to a space where we all will release the outside world and accept what's being like put on the screen and understand it and prompt ourselves to understand it. So it's related to land, but I think like to Nolan's point, land is it's such a broadly encompassing term. It's really about like, land in a lot of ways is like representative of like time, right? Like it really is this record of things. And I think like we exist in one form of time, but we can, you know, like looking at a black hole, we can infer the past and the future a little bit by spending time thinking and looking into it a little bit more. So, yeah.
Yeah, and Jared, I love how you shared a little bit about what draws you towards your medium. And I remember we all got a little excited when we realized, by happenstance, that there's this through line among you all of engagement with so-called new media, with film, photography, video, maybe versus something like an ancestral practice like weaving or other things. And I wonder if, you all can offer your perspectives on what, kind of like what Jared was talking about, what led you to these media and how they shape your work, both artistically and in community.
I think that it's interesting that we all work in the landscape intuitively using cameras, because I think about the history of what a camera is and how it was invented as a tool of colonialism to catalog and control people. And I think that we all see it as now a way to, or at least for me, I see it as a way to reclaim that power and take that back and use it for a different way of seeing. And I think what really drew me to photography in the first place is that you can manipulate reality to, I guess, sounds kind of crazy, but you can manipulate a picture to make things appear as a certain way that you see the world that others can never capture again. It's one moment in time that can never be repeated. And I think it's interesting, kind of what Jared was saying about time and how we're just in this one little slice, and the way that indigenous knowledge views time as more of a circular, in a circular context. It's interesting how I feel like I'm manipulating time basically with photography. Yeah.
I totally agree with that, and I would say that that's like a huge part of why I like filmmaking in particular. It's like, I agree that still photography is, you are able to manipulate time, and like how, Andrei Tarkovsky like famously called cinema sculpting time, like sculpting in time, and being able to use in cinema in particular, and I would say also still photography, you're able to force perspective, which is a rare thing that you often can't do in the world. But with cinema, you very much are able to force a perspective and have the viewer experience something in a linear way that you choose to experience, and not linear in the sense like A to B to C, that like the story or the narrative, but more so the sequencing of images, like you're playing it at a frame rate in a reel, say from beginning to end or whatever, or in time in general. And like, for me, to reject this idea of like the arrow of time, to Maya's point, and having it really look at this kind of, in the past year, I've been writing a film, and I really centered time as an area I wanted to explore, and I found myself equating it in like, not a non-cheesy way, but it was funny. Like, it felt like a river, like flowing through the ether in a way, and moments of time in particular. What I found I'm focusing on now in my work is like how moments and memories can feel like these kind of like whirlpools, right? Like you can get stuck in time in a lot of ways. Or like how rapids and caustic events in the fluid nature of things can really affect how we experience time. So we're all like time beings. And I think that, similar to sharing in like a cave, like the carvings on the wall, dancing in the light, cinema allows us to, again, enter a space where we subconsciously allow ourselves to forget time for a little bit. And we give ourselves surrender to this new idea, and I think that's really powerful, because we always, it's our human obligation, I think, to question our constructs of understanding at all times. And anything we can do to trick ourselves to reject those things or to reduce those barriers in our mind is important on like a soul fulfillment level. So I think that cinema, for me, is the closest thing I can do to take everything that I really like and experience emotionally and pack it into a place where other people can get the feeling. I'm just trying to convey a feeling, and cinema does that.
Yeah, I think like when obviously I feel like, as we grow as artists, we like constantly kind of reflect on this question, like how, like what shapes our approach to it. And like, whereas I feel like using kind of like a lot of like Western sort of like film concepts or like theory is great, but like as like my background, like I'm also a PhD student, and like with particular, like my background's in education. And I'm more particularly interested in like making sense of this through like indigenous knowledge frameworks in the context of like Passamaquoddy epistemologies and worldviews. So like turning towards kind of like language to think like how I make sense of my approach to photography into film, and like thinking through our language. So like the word that we use, first we don't separate like image and word. Like the same word that we use for book is the same thing that we would use for image. And I think that plays on like what Jared was saying with time. But then that word, Wikigin, in plural wikigonal, that the Hegan part of it, it denotes a tool. And that's sort of like how I've always understood, like my approach to it is like coming from an educational background, is using an environmental communications background, is like thinking of these images that we've always used as Passamaquoddy and Wabanaki people as a tool of communication to share like who we are, where we come from, our homelands, in order to preserve knowledge for future generations, and to also like have this continuation of storytelling from those relational understandings of who we are. And I feel like that really like shapes my approach to it, especially like thinking in the context of like contemporary context of like in working in like museum spaces, institutional spaces, where a lot of that approach is also shaped by the environment that I'm in. So like also thinking of like how that more understanding from our language to this particular form of art can also shape the institutional environments in which they are now housed in, and create that ideally change in relating to the practice and through that knowledge framework is sort of like what I'm interested in today. And then also just like the storytelling aspect of it, and the creative aspect of it, of like this balance between individual expression from a community knowledge that I feel like shows up in like having that balance within Indigenous art. But yeah, I feel like I'm really interested in making meaning of how I approach it and how it's used throughout history, like through how, you know, our ancestors may have like looked at these this form of art and aesthetic expression by like turning towards our language and turning towards our history, and making sense through that perspective and framework.
Yeah, and you know, something that Nolan had brought up earlier too is just around, I feel like it's just a continuation as well. It's like, it's a tool. It's a way to tell stories, right? It's what we've always done, essentially, like whether it's the petroglyphs, whether it's etched birch bark, it's just a continuation. And like we as people have always been adaptive. We've always embraced new technologies, you know, in a sense. And well, maybe not all of them, but really thought about, okay, like how can we utilize this as a tool, you know, of expression, to share in our realities, to continue this tradition of storytelling, of story making, of place making as well. And for me, there's also like that reclamation that you talked about, Maya, where it's like, it's so much of the language around like film is like so colonial too. It's like, yeah, you have to capture this, or you have to shoot this, you know? It's like, okay, we could call that something else maybe, but even though there's like almost a certain level of inherent violence within the language around film and photography, it's like, how do we take this, which from an early stage was used as kind of that anthropological documentation of people who would not exist in the future, and so it needed to be cataloged, and turn that completely on its head. Be like, no, now we're using it, you know, now we're continuing to catalog our existence that has persisted despite that understanding, that misunderstanding of who we are as people.
Thank you all so much. I think we have time for one internal question amongst us, and then we can open it up for a few more questions from the audience, if that sounds okay. I would love to just have you all share what, you know, you all are doing so much. I admire all of your work so deeply, and I'd love for just to take this opportunity for you all to share what you all are working on now, and maybe where do you want to go in the future.
Right now, I am working on an ongoing photographic series that I call Does the Land Remember?, in which I explore the landscape of what is now known as Maine, and I use my own body as a conduit to show the energy that's in the landscape. I'm making a book from this work that should be coming out within the next year. I have some work that's going to be, in terms of shows, that's coming up there's going to be one at Waterfall Arts in Belfast called Portals that I'm a part of. I'm going to be in a show at Space Gallery starting in July, and I'm working on organizing a solo exhibition at Boreal Theater in Millinocket, which focuses on my personal ancestral connection to the area with my ancestor Joseph Atian and his contributions to that area. Yeah, and in the future, I am hoping to go to grad school next year and just continue my work. Yeah.
I recently completed a short film with Molly Obamsoin and have been in the process of putting that through film festival circuits and feeling really good and solid about that. There's a few film projects that I have in the works right now, and working on a narrative that's pulling from and inspired by one of the traditional stories that I'm really excited to develop. And yeah, I recently just moved to New York City, and so yeah, just a lot of interfacing with a lot of creative people and directors and filmmakers and poets that I know down there that I'm really excited about. There's also this project that's happening at Dartmouth College coming up later in the year. I don't know how much I can publicly speak about it at this point, but I'm very excited about that as well, doing some video and visual work for that. So yeah.
Yeah. Similarly, with also Maya's my cousin. Also part of the Portals exhibit down at the Waterfall Arts Center in Belfast. That's coming up in June. And then later on in the year, in November, working on a sort of a community curated that's sort of being led by Sarah Sokabasin, Penobscot artists with the Colby Museum of Art that will be happening in November or opening in November. And then sort of like also working in the realm of documentary work and with my comrade Lakota here. We're part of Sunlight Media Collective, and right now we're working sort of on micro docs pertaining to a little bit more celebratory stories within Wabanaki communities, particularly in the realm of sort of indigenous knowledge and climate adaptation and all of the work that's going on in the communities. So just last week I was out on the Clam Flats with Tony Sutton, who was speaking to sort of all of the policies in which restrict Wabanaki access to these first foods that we have been separated from historically, and then also like out on the Clam Flats down at Zibayig, where we have, I believe, the world's largest clam gardens down in our homelands, and working with Eric Francis in that. So kind of just wanting to highlight more. Sunlight's past work has really been sort of highlighting stories about the Penobscot River case and our relationship to what is now Maine in the area of sovereignty. So we really wanted to focus on a little bit more celebratory stories and looking at all of the good work that's being done in the environmental realm across Wabanaki communities. So yeah, sort of just like working on a lot of sort of mixed media projects in relation to film, and also developing sort of a short film kind of restoring the history of Passamaquoddy homelands along the Scudic River, with Champlain's visit at St. Croix Island and how it relates to some of petroglyphs that we have that depict their interactions, and wanting to sort of re-narrate that history through a short film. And yeah.
So for this year, I'm fortunate enough to be a 2025 Sundance Institute Native Lab Fellow. So I'm writing my first feature film. Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, so So I last year I wrote like a very early draft of my first feature film, and then this year I'm workshopping that. So I had a chance to go out to Santa Fe in the end of April into May and workshop with some great other native filmmakers and some really amazing advisors, both native and industry professionals. And then for the next year, I'll be writing that, and we'll go out to the festival in January to hopefully like talk to folks about hopefully making it. And so really, like I've put all my creative energy into writing this film for the last year, and will continue to do so for the next year, with the future prospects of it getting financed and made. And simultaneous to that, I have this like deep yearning to actually make something like tangible. So writing is like a deeply like mind crazying, stir crazy like process. So I'm also working on this experimental film that's a short film, but it's kind of an exploration of place through like a sonic lens. So it's really going into places and capturing that, field recording and resampling them, and creating an experimental film that is capturing the intersection of sound, sight and sound, really. So I'm just starting that out, and that'll be like a short project for this year. Maybe it'll turn into something bigger, but those are the two things. The main thing, though, is writing my movie and hoping to have somebody in Hollywood be like, yeah, that's it. We're gonna buy that one or whatever. Like they're gonna give me money to go make it. Hopefully in Maine too. That's like a goal of mine with the film. It's a Wabanaki film, and I want that to be true across the whole thing, in the land, the people on the film, cast and crew, and all of it. So writing it is like the foothills of a very steep mountain, and I feel like I'm progressing to the next phase of that, fortunately. So that's where all my creative intentions are at right now. So thoughts and prayers.
You guys are so amazing. Thank you so much for giving us so much to think about and for sharing so much of yourselves with us today. And I'd love to, if we have time for maybe like one or two questions from the audience. If anyone is interested, I think there's some mics running around. Oh, is there a mic to the side, Megan? Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, I'm behind the column back here. Oh, no, it's okay. I just want to, Maya, can you talk a little bit about, I noticed in the images behind you that you're shooting in black and white, and would like to know a little bit about what cameras you're using. And when you're out in the woods, I know those photographs must have some concepts and some ideas before them. Could you talk a little bit about your process, about how you choose those places and what you use to do it? Thanks.
Yeah, so my process really involves a lot of research into a place, and in the past few years, I started using a lot of place name maps that have the language incorporated in them, and I started discovering all of these unknown histories, to me at least, that exist in the landscape and the clues that exist in the language. So part of my process is identifying, kind of like what Jared said, going back to the same place over and over again, kind of feeling the energy in the landscape. And I use a 4x5 large format film camera, and I shoot in black and white. And when I develop the film, one of these photographs, it'll come through, is a special process that I use. And that photograph, Ottawa Skinny Gassawuk, or Forest Spirits, was featured in the show that just closed upstairs called As We Are. The photograph was made using this special process in which I printed a negative and a positive on the same piece of darkroom paper to create the kind of ghostly shadow effect. A lot of my work involves like post-processing experimentation with changing contrasting light and layering the different negatives on top of each other to create a different kind of otherworldly, dreamy look to them. I do also work in the installation space as well, using natural found objects as well to kind of center the work in the land and bring the physical, like natural objects, like wood and sand and rocks into the landscape. I don't have any, oh yeah, that's the photo I was talking about. But yeah, I really enjoy the analog photographic process because it makes me really slow down and think about every single decision that I make. It's a lot slower than a digital camera per se. And when I'm in the landscape, I kind of get into almost like a moving meditation when I'm shooting. It really allows me to just kind of like lock in, you would say, and be present in with my art in the landscape. Yeah, thank you.
I think there's a,
Hi,
There- oh.
my name is Judy Walsh. I'm a paper conservator, and I spend a long time in museums trying to shepherd the past into the future. And I love to ask artists how they hope their art will age, and what you would like people like me to do to help the things you're making now last, to tell their stories in the future.
Yeah, it's a great point, and not a lot of stuff that I've made to date is printed, but in the future I hope to have, I've made things digitally, right? And I think like we live in an increasingly digital world, which is precarious. It's not very good for like archival purposes, as much as we think it's like infinite on the, you know, in the digital realm, it really isn't, and it's scary to think that we could lose things so quickly on hard drives or storage devices. So one thing I think about a lot is actually reprinting digital back to film positives so they can be projected. It's done in like some larger scope movies where they'll shoot it digitally and then they'll reprint it onto a 35 or 65 millimeter reel. So that's one thing to consider, is like reprinting digital materials for projection onto like celluloid, which is really cool. Always like, I think without deteriorating the actual work itself. For, you know, the very singular context of what I do is like, I'm increasingly moving toward a physical medium, so like actually shooting film, like 16 mil or 35 mil. But even in the digital space, working to reprint on projection reels and then having adequate archival spaces for celluloid. And I know that that can be weird too, so it's a whole thing. I don't know if that's helpful.
I think the concept of having, because everything I print photographically is archival, like it's said to last hundreds of years, but I think that everything's made to degrade and go back into the earth. So I hope that my work, it sticks around for a long time, but I think when nature takes over and everything gets decomposed back into the earth is how it should be. And yeah, I guess I will continue making things archivally, but is it ever really like a guarantee that it will stick around forever? No.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And like, as someone that uses a lot of archival documents, I'm like, I have like the contradictory thing existing in my head, the dialectics between like, I really want people in the future, like our people, to be able to look back and find it and see it and be like, wow, that was like 100 years ago, 200 years ago. But at the same time, I'm totally like that too. I'm like, no, like all things are made to degrade, like, and we as human beings really try to not have that be the case. But I feel like it is kind of a futile fight. We were talking a little bit before this about old like abandoned buildings and factories and things like that, and how, you know, they're built with this kind of idea that they're going to be there forever, and they've been abandoned. You know, it could be 20 years later and already nature is taking it back, you know, and we hope that we can push through that existentially maybe, but it'll always come back to us. Yeah.
Just something really quickly, like we're, again, like thinking through the like realms of like this relationship between like property and like intellectual property, like this idea of like preserving something forever, like that also makes me think of like forever easements and like how like these things like try to preserve this specific kind of like relationship to these things rather than let them kind of like be remade, and like especially like within the context of like indigenous knowledge, like the physical thing that you make, like it's important obviously, but there's also all of the like interaction and relationships that go into it. So like when you have like something that's, you know, in perfect condition forever, and people are just going towards that. Like, how is that impacting the like physical relationships around that object that also need to be sustained? So I kind of hold that contradiction to to that as well. Yeah.
Yes, we have one more question up here, but just gonna take it from this side just to keep it even. Molly, do you want to use this mic? Yeah.
Thank you. So I feel like often as Wabanaki artists, we're expected to talk about our Wabanaki influences and be kind of only in dialogue with our ancestors, but all of us are, modern artists that are inspired by the entire world of art and incredible high artists. And so I wanted to ask you guys if your art was contextualized between one Wabanaki or one native artist maybe, and in dialogue with one other artist in an exhibition. Who would those be? Thinking of artists like Kent Monkman, right, who's putting up his piece facing a Rothko. Who are the two that you're sandwiched between or in dialogue with? Or just two, not the two, just two.
That's really hard. It has to, so a Wabanaki and a non-Wabanaki? Okay. I really love the works of Francis Bacabia. He was a Dadaist and a surrealist, and found his works at a very formative time in my life, and kind of the way that he would interplay with like overlays just through painting. But I don't know, there's something about them that really speak to me. And yeah, I mean, that's a really tough one, Wabanaki artist. Okay. I don't know. No, I think that is important though, because it's like a lot of my work is also pulling from tradition. And I've been working with a lot of Birch lately, and yeah, like Toma Joseph's work, I think would be like having kind of those two very different things coming from different places in the world. But I think there's kind of a somewhere in that Venn diagram that exists, there's some of me, I guess.
I would echo what he says about Toma Joseph. I feel like I really connect to the way he would write these little messages on his baskets. They would say like, go with love, or remember me, or be safe, or things like that. And I just really thought that he was putting like a life into it by doing that. And in terms of modern artists, my series that I'm working on now was kind of inspired by this series by Dawood Bey. He's a photographer, and this series was based on locations along the Underground Railroad that he photographed. But the way he photographed him gave this sort of sublime, in-between worlds feelings that I really appreciate about the quality of his work. And I would also like to say, in terms of Wabanaki artists, my own family, I come from basket makers on my dad's side and my mom's side, and I cherish being able to physically hold their creations, even though I didn't get to meet most of them. And yeah, I think it's something really special about having family members pass down their creativity and pushing that legacy through in whatever way you can. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely have a bunch of inspirations that I'm like, I want to like rattle off all these names. I don't know, like, but yeah, I would totally agree with that last sentiment that Maya was just sharing. I'm fortunate enough in my family to have the basket making tools that were given to my dad, that were my great grandmother's, that she got from her great grandmother. And they're very old, and it's like amazing to be able to just like hold them and see them. I look at those things with a lot of admiration, and I don't think that they looked at them as like art or creation in that way, but they're clearly well loved and like a living thing in their own way, and will continue to be. And that's a huge source of inspiration on the Wabanaki side. I would say I'm just gonna say a couple of shout outs to people now like that have inspired me more recently. Not Wabanaki, but native artists is experimental filmmaker Sky Hopinka. He's really talented filmmaker. And then in the experimental realm, Stan Brakhage, who's like a really well-known experimental filmmaker. And then for the narrative film side, like the classics of like Ingmar Bergman and Andrei Tarkovsky, like those are the two that I continually go back and study their films to see how they really pioneered narrative structure and how that relationship is built with the camera in a time when they weren't so, even though they weren't so influenced by executives telling them it needs to be like an entertainment amusement park, Marvel movie roller coaster, you know? So it's like they were like artisans of the time that were actually able in their own way to some extent explore the medium of film with some funding and stuff and cool stuff. And I just love their stuff. So that's a few too many. If they could all have one big show together, I would go every day. Yeah. Let's put it that way, including my great-grandparents.
I know there's a delay. There we go. Yeah, I think like, and there really isn't, you know, and I like their Passamaquoddy ancestors. But I've been kind of like referring to the petroglyphs and rock art a lot, and just like I really do draw kind of a lot of thinking around storytelling through visuals and a lot of kind of like life from that place, because it was that region where it's at and what's now Machias Port it's just such an area of life that I feel like I do draw a lot from in the time that I spend out there. And then more like similarly, I've been working with birch bark in canoe making, and then also in a few other pieces I'm making that combines kind of photography and birch bark etching, and through that kind of like similarly like Toma Joseph and looking at the stories that he would leave with like Mediqua Haman, like Remember Me, and again like using these images as tools of communication to mobilize understandings of who we come from and who we are to future generations. Then also like sort of more contemporary Wabanaki artists who is now an ancestor, but like I was visiting the Abbey Museum in what's now Bar Harbor a few weeks ago, and just like going through the archives there. And particularly like they have a lot of David Moses Bridges archive, not just his work, but also a lot of his tools. And like kind of similarly, like you can sort of like feel the connection through the materials and through the communities that it's coming from when you kind of interact with those forms of life. And then more on the kind of like non-native side of things, it's actually not a visual artist. Well, he does do some experimental visual films with his music, but there's a Japanese artist, his name's Masakatsu Takagi, and he kind of like centers place in his work where he visits these areas, builds a relationship to it, and then doesn't come with like anything written. He just sort of sits in that environment and starts to play with the sounds and place that surrounds him, and then he does turn those into visual sort of experimental projects as well. But just again, that attention in relation to place with his music that he makes is
Amazing. Well, can you all join me in offering a huge round of applause for these panelists? Welcome back, everybody. All right. So glad we have such an amazing, lively group. We're so thankful to you all for being here again. And it's my pleasure now to correctly introduce our second panel of the day from Advisory to Policy, which will be moderated by Teresa Secord and is featuring panelists Sarah Sakbison, Chris Newell, and Anna Sularkis. Thank you all so much.
Ooh, thank you, Amy. What a pleasure it is to be here today and see everyone. For those who don't know, I'm a PMA trustee, and I'm really proud to see other trustees out there, so thank you for coming and supporting this great symposium. I have to say, from that first panel, I don't know about the word emerging artists. They sound like they've arrived to me. Right? Great panel. And I asked Maya if it was okay to share that she used to work in the cafe here. And so I think it's remarkable, too, that, a true artist will find a way into a museum regardless. And so, and I didn't ask her this one, but my sons and Maya and her sister, actually, her older sister, were actually in the same daycare on Indian Island decades ago, so we're all related. Okay, so for our panel, it was so interesting. We came to the conclusion that we wanted to ask for, the title to be from advisory to policy. And the history of that is kind of interesting because I'm probably the most senior person in this, the panelists on the symposium, and I have the hair to prove it. But I have a couple of things there. One is, I can remember a time when, as Indigenous artists, or of course I was also the head of an Indigenous arts organization for 21 years here in Maine, the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance. Indigenous people were often asked to be advisors to the museum or the institution, not on making policy, not real trustees. And so this is why I'm really pleased to see this evolution of where we're at today. And the same thing, I'm also almost 8 years now at the Colby College Museum of Art as a museum board of governor. So I'm kind of glad we're past that stage. But we still want to talk today about helping to make policy in museums, and how can we as Indigenous artists, educators, and curators on this stage help to inform policy. And I guess one other story I want to share before I start with my amazing panel is I remember being in Portland, Maine Arts Commission meeting, and I was a trustee, a new commission member, sworn in, and this is a state commission on the arts, and sworn in by Governor John McKernan himself, actually, years ago, for those of you from Maine, 1995. And I was told by one of the other commission members that my first, really kind of interaction and speech to the commission on, what I hope to do as a commission member there was to try to help explain why the commission, the state arts agency, was sending money to a bunch of Indians up north making baskets in the woods. I mean, quite literally. So I guess with that story, I want to share that in 30 years, we've seen a remarkable change with Jeremy Frey Woven here last year. I think, that money was well spent 30 years ago to help seed the first efforts of the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance. So with that, thank you. Thank you. So with that, I wanted to ask each panelist to tell us a little bit more about themselves, but as they speak to the topic of their experiences in moving from advisory to policy, and asking them to share an example of what each is working on now or recently. So Chris, I want to start with you, since we're in our own esteemed museum here, and how you as an educator have worked with the Portland Museum of Art on a couple of levels, as a contractor and also in working on the reinterpretation of the exhibition on the second floor.
So for those that don't know me, my name's Chris Newell. I'm from the Passamaquoddy tribe, born and raised in Madocmigook, and I am an educator by trade. I get a lot of different labels because of the lot of different work that I do. And where that comes from is literally, following family footsteps. My father was an educator as well. I got to grow up watching him and learn his pedagogy, amongst other things. Museums is part of his life experience, and you can imagine, for him visiting places like the Harvard Peabody Museum back in the 1970s, where they still had Wabanaki remains in the collection, things like that, were experiences that he was able to pass on to me in the work that I do. Now, my forte is museum education, and I worked for 6 years at the Pequot Museum as education supervisor. And what I loved about the Pequot Museum is that the Pequot Museum is a historical museum that tells the history of what is now the state of Connecticut unapologetically from the Pequot perspective. And that to me was very powerful, because I saw children, even third graders, that would come through and learn a very hard history, but they became so enlightened about how their state became a state, that they would leave the museum more excited than when they arrived. And that's the power of museums for me. Now, learning and seeing a native curated museum, fully curated museum, that telling its own story from its own perspective, I started to look at the museum world and realize how much the museum world informs us as Americans about this country. And when it came to the work with the Portland Museum of Art, what I found was a staff here and a director that was very much looking to shake things up. They use the words art for all, and when they say that, they really mean it, because museums has historically, been the home of basically European art, or even Euro-American art, and that's one of the reasons why Native people are hardly represented in the workforce or in the art as well. And so when the PMA decided to strip down their entire second floor and redo it, what they did was, before they started any of the work, they brought in a lot of advisors. But in this particular case, it was not done the way it has been done in the past, that Teresa was kind of inferring. Sometimes we hire a Native Advisory Council, and sometimes they're just there kind of as dressing. But what I tell people about the work that I do with Agama Educational Initiative when we advise museums is that if you're going to work with Native peoples, then you have to involve them at the ground floor, at the idea stage. And so when it came to the reinterpretation of this Colonial Museum second floor, and the involvement of Native advisors, non-Native advisors, just a wide variety of people that were looking to use art to tell the story of Maine from multiple different perspectives. And to the credit of the PMA, they got their best results because they followed that process. And that's one of the things that I try to remind people the most. So when it comes to that shift from advisory to policy, it really involves putting Native people in places that they can make decisions. And that requires not only following that process of having Native people at the ground floor in your projects, but also having people like Teresa, who sits on the board here for the PMA. But what I always tell people is that she should not be the only one, because she should not be the singular Wapanaki voice. There should, no single person can speak for all of us. And she knows that, I know that, we all know that. And so having a multiplicity of voices, and even ones that disagree with one another, is only to the benefit of the PMA. And those are some of the important steps that I've seen happen, especially working through that particular project.
Anna, when we had our little Zoom, you mentioned helping set up an artist residency at a museum in Colorado. So I wanted to ask you about that, and then also ask you how else in your work, as an installation artist and actually a professor of art, have you worked with institutions in supporting contemporary artists? And you could share. Maybe this is too many questions, but I did see the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens project come up. So maybe just your same thoughts on how have you helped move institutions from advisory to policy.
So my name's Anna Sukalarkis. I'm Navajo, Creek, and Greek. I think I'm the one native non-Wabanaki artist a part of this, so thank you for inviting me. During the summer, I'm based in Booth Bay Harbor, and during the academic year, I'm an associate professor at University of Colorado Boulder in art practices. I work in sculpture, video, installation, performance, pretty much everything but painting. And so I've work in a lot of kind of newer genres, different disciplines, and something I just wanted to kind of think back to as Chris was talking, it made me just kind of reflect on, this is why I became an artist, was the relationships that I saw with Native artists and museums. My dad makes jewelry. He's a Navajo silversmith. And I grew up going to art markets with him, going to, you know, Santa Fe Indian Market, to ones that were all over the country, to him selling to galleries and to collectors and whatnot. And I remember something even at a very young age was the way that he was treated. To me, he's the smartest man in the world. Like, he is just kick ass, you know? Like, he's just, like, awesome. And they treated him as though it was just a craft that he made, and that there was no thought behind it, and there was no intellectual ability that was, you know, that was enshrined in like all of the silver and all the materials he used, and the story and the history and the ancestry. And I remember that being like 6 years old and thinking, why are they treating him like he's dumb? Like, this is ridiculous. And so that's something that stuck with me, was this idea that the work that we made had no intellectual structure to it. And so I think, to me, as I became an artist, that's something that I always pushed back on. And I thought about like abstract expressionist artists and things like that I was learning in art history, and I was like, they're throwing paint on the ground, but people are assuming that there is real, you know, ideology behind that, that it's context, you know, it's based in history in some way. And so it's worth more. And so to me, that's what really made me want to be not only an artist, but a strong academic student. And so to be able to go to places and to not have that part of my work questioned. And so, I don't know, like when I think about that, like this whole structure of museums had a very, you know, strong influence on me very early on. And so when I started coming up and I started making work and interacting with museums, that's something that I never worried about, was what they wanted. I was never worried about selling work. I was never worried about when people were like, well, that doesn't look native. I mean, my work is, you'll see it doesn't quite have the same look of other people's. And that's something that I have always pushed back against, because I feel like my work, no matter what it looks like, it's made by a Native person, it's based in Native philosophies and ideologies, and it's based on the stories that I grew up hearing from all of my family and my community. And so to me, it's for us to evolve and to push those standards and to push the understanding and definitions that are placed upon us, especially within places like museums, because the greater, you know, public see it as a place of influence, as a place of education. And so we need to be always evolving and like rethinking what that museum is sharing with the public. In my kind of stance as like an art consultant, I've worked with the teacher advisory group with the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. I restructured educational workshops for their K through 12 curriculum and outreach they do. I'm on the board of the Harpo Foundation, which is a national arts organization that gives like $10,000 grants to underrepresented artists across the country. And we just started a new Native, it's called the Impact Award, the Native Art Award for $25,000 for an under kind of like an unknown in some ways Native artist out there that has been working for a long time and just hadn't gotten the recognition that we think they deserve. And most recently, I've been working more locally in Colorado with an organization to develop a Native art residency. And so that'll start, I think, in either 2026 or 2027. Okay, what was your other question?
Share a little bit about your project at the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens, just in that Shane is here as well,
Yeah.
moderated that great conversation. But I guess I remember that, you know, I thought that was amazing that project went beyond like the standard land acknowledgement, right? Where that is the first thing you see still when you walk up to the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens, but that's not the only thing we're going to see now. But yet it took like 2 or 3 years for that relationship to be built with Indigo Arts Alliance, and then your work as an artist and Shane. So if you just wanted to share about how that came about.
Yep. So it's this amazing collaboration that was with Indigo Arts Alliance here in Portland and the Coastal Maine Botanical Garden. And I was brought in about almost like 2 years ago now as an artist to create a commission of an outdoor sculpture for the gardens. And like I said, I live in Booth Bay during the summer, and I've been going there for almost 24 years now every summer. And I remember the first time I was in Booth Bay, there were no brown people and stood out like a sore thumb. And I just remember last summer being there for the convening and the opening of our installations there, and how amazing it was to have such like a strong communal feel and strong voices that were a part of everything. But I think for me being a part of it, I was so grateful to be invited to make a piece. This is it right here. But I also, as an artist and a person not from Maine, I have a very strong relationship to land, like that was spoken about in the first panel. So that's something I'm aware of every single day I'm in Maine, is that this is not my land. That I love it, I think it's so beautiful, like I love the smells of the fresh sea air, like everything. I feel like I want to be a part of it, but I know it's not mine. And so I think about that, and I want to be very conscious of that, because as a Native person, being a visitor to a place, that means that I'm always trying to do everything in a respectful way that makes sure that the voice that I'm bringing to this isn't trying to overtake anybody else's. And that's where this project came from. It's a piece that has my name on it, but it integrated so many other people and so many other voices and so many other stories. And to me, that's what I was trying to uplift. In some ways, I thought of myself as like this pedestal, and I was trying to bring that Indigenous local voice, kind of to heighten that in some ways, and to remind people that there is this history that's been around the Middens, for over 5,000 years. And on the Booth Bay Peninsula, most people don't know that it's like completely covered with these middens in all different places. And so to be able to kind of help remind people of that, I was really excited about, and to be able to bring natives here. And I remember they brought through some students during the summer while I was making this, and the kids recognized what was going on. They saw the text in the pieces, and they giggled over on the side. And that's why I make work, is like that giggle, the knowledge that this little Native kid is like recognizing humor and connecting with it, and they're like, this is mine. This is part of what I am. And I'm really excited about that.
For those who don't know, the shell middens are these ancient, basically piles of oyster shells, and they're really prehistoric in the sense of European history, that they're, hundreds and thousands of years old at the coast of Maine. And so, Anna, you had said your father-in-law said the first thing he wanted to do was show you these shell middens when she showed up in Maine. It's like he wanted you to see, like, Wabanaki history and culture and art through that. And I thought that was just remarkable. And then I have to put in a pitch for Shane too, because his work, there is woven copper fiddlehead ferns. It's pretty remarkable. So you should all go visit the Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens this summer. So Sarah, I've been so proud to watch your work, being on the Colby College Museum of Art Board of Governors, and also know that you have been connected with the Lunder Institute, with the Osario Fellowship, and that's a few years ago now. But just watching you move through the museum as an artist, you have an amazing piece up behind that's been showing, that was in the painted exhibition. And I just wonder if you could share your thoughts. I know you're working on an upcoming exhibition now as a curator, and so you're an example of someone who's really moved through a museum space, from not being present there at all to being a fellow to being your art was represented in the collection, I guess, before, but anyway, I'm telling your story, you should tell it. And so how has that been to move through that space at the Colby College Museum of Art, from advisory to policy to now be curating?
Yeah. I'm Sarah Sockbeeson, Penobscot basket maker, artist, and now working towards more of curatorial roles within the museum space, but also I'm a current board member at the Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor, and Lunder Institute fellow. I think, I got my start really just wishing to be an artist. I think that was my greatest aspiration, was to create art, and just it was about expression, and I've always just enjoyed making things with my hands and just coming up with ideas. So that's really where I kind of gravitated when I thought about aspirations and where I wanted to go with my career. And it's only happened through, showing my work and being within proximity to museums and educational spaces that I found new kind of realms to work within. And I think the initial kind of start with working with museums was at the Abbey Museum, and working with them on different educational programming and being invited to do demonstrations, as well as working with them for the gift shop and then the markets and whatnot. So that was really where I got kind of a better feel for working with museums more consistently. And I think I really appreciated the fact that that institution being within the Acadia National Park system has the ability to broadly educate people on scale, really. And so that kind of showed me the way that this is an opportunity to share our culture, to educate, to kind of bring people up to speed, correct narratives, things like that. I saw it as this entity that could really help further the things that we aspire to support and further, So I think that's really when I started to head towards museum spaces. And since then, I've done more work with different museums, and I can really appreciate now that museums and institutions that are showing our work, but also collecting our work, have the potential to really support what artists are making, new contemporary works, but also to platform our voices and to give us a seat at the table and allow us to speak for ourselves instead of having somebody else speak for us. And so I think that's really important. And so that's why I've begun leaning more towards curatorial lately, is because I think it's an opportunity to tell our own stories. And I don't think everyone can tell our stories from our perspective in a way that kind of appreciates the knowledge that we keep and the different types of connections that we have to place, to each other, to our community. And so I think that's really important to come through the exhibition, the showcasing of the work, and to not just present our work in an archaeological kind of format, or to present our work in some sort of way that meets the customer or visitors' expectations. It's really, to me, all about expressing ourselves in a genuine way and having the opportunity to really show our work in more contemporary kind of mediums, or however we feel best to display our kind of true voice. And so I'm really working towards that, and currently working on an exhibit with Colby College, and that is set to open this November. So that has been informed by community the whole way through, and that's been really important about sharing our values and about working together collaboratively and all having our own say.
Does that exhibition have a title yet, or?
This Friday was our deadline.
Okay, we got it. And there are 6 or 8 artists in that?
We have 8, I believe.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's going to be really exciting again. Previously, I think, there were 2 kind of standalone major Indigenous art exhibitions, well, 3 including Jeremy Frey, but over the last 4 or 5 years. And one was the Wewinikan at Colby, and then next was Painted which was the great Pueblo exhibition and Tao Society paintings. And so, but some of that included, traditional art as well. And so what I'm excited about here is this, going into the contemporary. And so I think based on that, I wanted to ask some questions too about native curating, like how important is that? There aren't many native curators in New England. And again, I've been in museum spaces and advising for a long time. And often I would see someone come in from somewhere else and say, well, it's because you don't have any Wabanaki curators, and really there only are one or two trained curators. And so this is why I'm so excited, to see you moving in that work. But how important is it, that native curating take place? And I guess on this one, I'll start at the other end with Anna and just ask, do you think the curatorial practice sets up a different dynamic, and paradigm with the art as you walk in?
Absolutely. I think that when you're working with a native curator, there's an understanding of relationship to the process, to the end product, and to what will happen. I feel like it's a bit more holistic thinking, and there are things that you don't have to explain, that they just understand. But I think the biggest thing that I notice the difference between native and non-native curators is that as an artist, I've been working as a professional artist for 25 years or something like that. Or God, I don't know, 28 years. Eesh. And so, and that's the thing is I didn't know how to advocate. I still am learning how to advocate for myself within the museum structure, within the gallery structure. And because there aren't that many natives out in the contemporary art world, there aren't people that I connect with necessarily, that will say, hey, this is what you should ask for. This is a norm over here. Instead, I think a lot of times native artists were like, okay, I guess that sounds good, right? Or yeah, I guess, getting half of what this other artist gets sounds fine, And you just don't know. And whereas native curators, I feel like, have your best interest, and I've noticed that they are my best advocates, and they're like, you're asking for this, but we're gonna give you this, which is a lot more, and we're gonna pay for that. And it just financially, because I feel like just as native people, we just don't ask for what we're worth a lot of the time, that there are advocates for that. And also in terms of just space and in all aspects of curation in terms of an exhibition. And so, to me, that's amazing to have that, and to know that I've worked with curators who've done that. I mean, there are some non-native curators who go to bat for you and do all those things as well, but I feel like it's a little bit more kind of spread out. And that's the thing is what programs are in place to help us develop curators from a young age, maybe in high school. I was thinking during the last panel when the artists were up here, and I was just amazed and blown away, with all the knowledge that they were sharing and doing everything. And I'm like, okay, what could these local museums do to help, bring in, because there's kids out there that probably want to work in a museum, but they don't know how, because maybe somebody from their community has never done that before. And so what if there was an internship specifically for Wabanaki youth, to start here at the museum, and then it grows into maybe 2 or 3 internships over the summer, and those students are naturally drawn, and all of a sudden they're seeing their, other, fellow students doing stuff like that, and their ideas open up into not just being curators, but art critics, art historians, that it's so multifaceted. Can you imagine how native preparators would be, in a museum, or conservationists? And so that's something that I think it's much more holistic, and something that we should be aspiring to, is that how do we create that structure? Because curators go out and they find the artists that they want to highlight. But imagine if that was a native curator going out, and finding people that other people didn't quite see, right away. And so I think there's so much excitement in that. And so it's about creating that structure at a young age. And I'm thinking about that from the internal part of the museum, but I think also, since we're here at the PMA, that's also something to think about in terms of the board of trustees. Like something that we never talk about in Native communities, or we don't use it this way, is the word like philanthropy. Like, why is it important? Why should people, be part of, giving and those types of things? And so talking about that at a young age and like cultivating that in a community to where they see themselves in what they're giving to is also important. And so I think it's not just the internal, it's the external, but in ways that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, and I guess it also goes to, all different positions. As you mentioned earlier, Chris, I think you talked about some statistics in the workforce and how few, Indigenous people, even as a percentage of our of people in this nation are working in the workforce in museums. And I think I had a quote from you: you need to have Native people in positions of intellectual and artistic authority. And do you want to speak more to that on, how you could envision that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, museums have a history with Native people, and there's a reason why Native people are just now becoming part of, the museum family. And, the statistics, the American Library Association, the IMLS, amongst others, they do surveys about, who is in the art museum world. And the latest statistics is that the workforce of the art museum world is 0.48 of 1% Native. And we represent 2% of the population in this country. Now that is an increase from 3 years ago when it was 0.37 of 1%. Okay, so I mean, the current climate of saying that DEI policies are harmful to us and things like that, these policies were designed to address these types of deficiencies that exist in the world. And what I also remind people of is that of that 0.48 of 1% that are in the art museum world, 80% of them are at entry level. They're visitor experience people. There are the security guards, and there's very few Native people in positions of intellectual authority, and that is where the change has to happen. To get Native people into decision-making places. I was blessed to be executive director of the Abbey Museum, and to see what that felt like. To be in that position rather than to be somebody on the outside constantly criticizing. So I got to do things that I felt, the Abbey is a colonial museum. We'll never fully decolonize it, right? But indigenize some of the practices of the Abbey Museum. And I can think about one of the policy changes that I made during my short stint there, in that we have a store and we buy from Wabanaki artists and we sell their art in the store. But one of the things that every museum does is they ask the artists to discount their work to get it into the store. And I didn't feel that was right, especially with the pandemic. I started right at the beginning of the pandemic. That meant a lot of Native artists that previously weren't on the internet were going to the internet. And so if we're buying their art and forcing them to discount their price to get it in our store, then that means we're now actively competing with them in their own webpage, at the same price. And that didn't seem fair to me at all. The museum should not, benefit from that. It should be working to, treat equitably, those artists and buy at their asking price and then mark up what you need to mark up. That way you're not in competition. If somebody wants that particular piece and wants to pay the extra, they will do that. But it makes it fair to the artists at that level. And that's what having somebody as a Native person in a position of intellectual authority can do to the system, right? And that's one of the things that we often do when we get into museums, especially Native curators, is they are oftentimes able to criticize the system. Native art has been displayed, as was mentioned in the previous panel, through the anthropological gaze. The MFA Boston is a great example of that, and it was even mentioned by Lakota how Native art, you can usually find it in a basement gallery. Guess where it is in the MFA Boston? It's in a basement gallery, and if you go into that gallery, you're going to find a wall and a half of Southwest pottery. You're going to find Plains artwork. You're going to find a little bit from the Northeast, but there is no ashplint basketry. There is no wampum beadwork or anything of that sort represented within that museum. And that's an example of a very old school colonial museum with no Native people in positions of intellectual authority, save for one indigenous curator who, she's a one-woman army, but there's only so much she can do to change things. So putting Native people in positions of power, right? These DEI initiatives, especially in museums, really mean something, because it will not only create a better product, but will also criticize some of the past, practices of museums of, being transactional and extractive, and look toward a new future where there is, parity, with the artists, with the Native curators, with the people that are running the museum, so that there is intellectual authority being expressed all the way through the entire institution.
Sarah, do you want to speak to that same question about the importance of Native curating? And
Yeah,
Thank you.
I definitely feel as though we do need more people in those kind of positions, but I've kind of come to the table. I didn't realize that that was kind of the career path for me, but I quickly, once I kind of developed more and more of a relationship and sort of learned the ropes, it was actually like another Native curator that kind of inspired me and encouraged me and really allowed me to know that I do belong there, that I didn't necessarily train in museum studies or curatorial work, so I didn't know that that was a place that could be for me. But once I realized, that there is kind of a deficit in the field for that curatorial representation by Native people, I quickly realized this is something that is important and something worth pursuing. And I also love the idea of having, when we're in these positions, a lot of times we are trying to kind of bring our community with us, and we don't want to speak for every other Native person, so we kind of look to our community to not only showcase them and empower our community, our fellow community members and artists, but also to have the chance to work with them more and allow them to speak for themselves, because we can't all, as Native people, speak for one another. And I think as contemporary people, we come from two kind of different worlds, and every tribe is different, and we have different histories and whatnot. So when we come to the table, we kind of are able to draw from contemporary kind of lens, but also, if we're lucky, still have ties to traditional knowledge that can go back for generations and generations. And I think having that kind of lens, being able to see that, is something that's unique and something we bring to the table that isn't always present. So I think it's really, to me, very important. And during some of the reinstall work that we did on the exhibit, Painted, I found that because we had a Native advisory kind of committee for that exhibit, there were so many things that we kind of delved into the story that otherwise wouldn't have been told. And sometimes when you present works, and specifically this exhibit included works of the Southwest and Pueblo people, and so therefore people coming in with no context, just seeing this imagery could potentially associate the people depicted within the images as Wabanaki people. And so we really wanted to bring not only a Pueblo perspective to that gallery space, but also a Wabanaki perspective. And it really was a great kind of meshing of minds, because we each had things that we kind of brought up, thought of, and I just think the collaborative process is really something that we should be supporting more and encouraging when we can.
And I'm reminded too on that Pueblo exhibition that I forgot how many Pueblo advisors there were, but it was an entire, 6. And one even was a Pueblo governor and a professor. And so bringing in that Pueblo worldview, like you said, even on the placement of objects, like you didn't realize it, but their worldview was all through that exhibition. I'm just sorry it didn't travel afterward. I wanted to switch gears just for a second, as I see, time-wise, we want to leave a little bit for questions. I want to talk about artist authenticity. And the reason I bring this up is that, again, I'm on 2 boards, so I guess I'm looking for the rest of the panel's help. In